You were never anything, Rachel. Sign it and disappear. Tom Miller threw the divorce papers across the table, sending her teacup crashing to the floor. He loomed over her jaw, tight eyes cold. You think you can fight me, I'll bury you. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him steady, unblinking like a woman who already knew exactly how this story ended. Then she picked up the pen and signed her name. Not her married name, her real name. Rachel Vanderhoven. Tom never even glanced at it. He had no idea he had just handed a billionaire heiress her freedom. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Tom Miller had always believed that life was a competition and that the man with the most wins at the end of the day was the man who mattered. That belief had carried him far. From a cramped studio apartment in New Haven to a 4,000-square-foot colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut. From an entry-level analyst position to vice president of strategic development at Meridian Tech Solutions, one of the fastest-growing mid-size firms in the Northeast Corridor. By 34, Tom Miller had checked every box he had ever drawn for himself, and he wore that fact like a second skin. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately assessed who was worth talking to. He calculated net worth in the first 60 seconds of a conversation. He remembered the brand of watch on a CEO's wrist before he remembered the CEO's last name. People who knew him professionally admired his sharpness. People who knew him personally found him exhausting. But Tom had never lost much sleep over what people found him to be, because Tom was busy moving forward, always upward, and anyone who couldn't keep pace was simply left behind. Rachel Jenkins had been different, or at least she had seemed different back in the beginning. He had met her 7 years ago at a charity gala his firm had co-sponsored. She had been volunteering, helping guests find their table assignments, wearing a simple blue dress that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with function. She had laughed easily. She had listened when he talked. She hadn't asked him about his title or his salary or his 5-year plan. She had asked him what book he was reading, and when he admitted he hadn't read a book in 2 years, she had laughed again and said, "That's okay, I'll loan you one." He had thought that was charming. He had thought she was charming. He had fallen for her in the way that men like Tom sometimes fall quickly, completely, and almost entirely based on how she made him feel about himself. She was calm where he was frantic. She was patient where he was impulsive. She was kind in a way that felt almost foreign to him, and in those early years he had mistaken her kindness for simplicity. That was his first mistake, though he wouldn't know it for a long time. They had married after 18 months. A modest ceremony because Rachel had asked for modest, and at the time Tom had agreed, telling himself it was practical. They had built a life together in the Colonial on Birchwood Lane. Rachel had continued working as a registered nurse at Greenwich Hospital. Tom had continued climbing. And somewhere between the 3rd year and the 5th, he had stopped seeing Rachel clearly and started seeing her only in comparison to what he wanted next. She never complained. That was the thing people didn't understand about Rachel. The thing Tom himself had stopped appreciating and started resenting. She never raised her voice. She never demanded more than she asked for. When Tom worked late, she kept a plate warm and asked no questions. When Tom came home tense and short-tempered, she gave him space and asked no questions. When Tom started mentioning Jessica's name with just a little too much frequency, Jessica from the product division, Jessica with the sharp laugh and the designer wardrobe and the way of looking at Tom like he was already the most important man in any room, Rachel simply became quieter. Not wounded quiet, not angry quiet, just quiet. Like a lake on a windless day, deep and still and giving nothing away. Tom took that stillness for acceptance. He took it for defeat. He told himself Rachel had no fire, no ambition, no real understanding of the world he was trying to build. He told himself she was a good woman, certainly a decent woman, but not the kind of woman who belonged in the next chapter of his story. He told himself all of this with great conviction, because men like Tom Miller are extraordinarily skilled at narrating their own choices into moral sense. The night he decided to ask for the divorce, he had been out to dinner with Jessica at a restaurant on the Upper East Side that Rachel would never have chosen. Jessica had leaned across the table and said, "Tom, you deserve to be with someone who actually matches you." And he had driven home on the I-95 with that sentence ringing in his ears like a bell he couldn't unhear. Rachel was in the kitchen when he got home, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a paperback still in her scrubs from a double shift. She looked up when he walked in. No particular expression, just present, just waiting. "We need to talk," Tom said. "Okay," Rachel said. She closed her book. She wrapped both hands around her mug. He sat down across from her. He had rehearsed this. He had actually rehearsed it, which was a thing he would later feel ashamed of, though not for many years. "Rachel, I think we've grown apart. I think we both know this marriage isn't working anymore, and I think the honest and respectful thing is to acknowledge that and move forward separately." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were steady, brown and steady, and entirely unreadable. "Are you in love with someone else?" she asked. He had prepared for tears. He had prepared for accusations. He had not prepared for the directness of that question, and it caught him somewhere in the chest before he recovered. "That's not the point," he said. "The point is that I think we want different things." "Are you in love with someone else, Tom?" she asked again. Same tone, same steadiness, no heat in it, just the question clean and precise as a surgical cut. "I think I've developed feelings for someone, yes," he said. "I think you deserve someone who is fully present for you, and I'm not that person anymore." Rachel was quiet for so long that Tom started to feel the room change around him. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. The clock above the stove ticked 3 times. "All right," she finally said. That was all. "All right." Tom blinked. "You're not going to, don't you want to—" "What would you like me to say, Tom?" she asked, and there was nothing sharp in it, nothing cruel. It was a genuine question. "I don't know," he admitted. "Something, anything." "I think you've made your decision," Rachel said. "So let's handle this cleanly." She picked up her mug, took a sip of tea. "I'll call an attorney this week." Tom sat there feeling strangely empty. He had expected a battle. He had steeled himself for a war, and she had simply folded the conversation up like a piece of paper and put it away, and he did not know what to do with the fact that it had cost her nothing visible. Or at least, that's what he told himself in the car, later driving back to Jessica's apartment. He told himself Rachel simply didn't care enough to fight. He was wrong, of course, but Tom Miller was very good at being wrong about Rachel. The attorney Rachel hired was a woman named Patricia Cole, quiet and methodical, who specialized in mediated divorce settlements and had an office above a dry cleaner on Greenwich Avenue. Tom had expected Rachel to come in with demands. The house, the savings, alimony, some form of financial retaliation for the years she had given him. Instead, Patricia Cole slid a single document across the conference table and said, "My client's requests are as follows: restoration of her maiden name, a clean separation of all jointly held assets with no future claims on either side, and a mutual non-disclosure agreement protecting both parties from public discussion of the terms." Tom's attorney, Marcus Reed, looked up from the document with an expression Tom would later describe as confused relief. He leaned over and whispered, "Tom, she's asking for almost nothing. The joint savings, a small settlement, and the car. She doesn't want the house. She doesn't want ongoing support." Tom had leaned back in his chair and felt the familiar flush of victory warm his chest. He had looked across the table at Rachel, who was seated with her hands folded and her eyes on the document rather than on him, and he had thought, she knows she has no leverage. She knows she's getting out of this the best way she can. "Seems reasonable," Tom said. And he tried very hard not to let the satisfaction show in his face, and he failed. Rachel did not look up. The divorce was finalized in 3 weeks. Tom kept the Colonial on Birchwood Lane, his investment portfolio, his retirement accounts, and his lifestyle entirely undisturbed. Rachel walked away with her car, a modest cash settlement, and her name, Rachel Vanderhoven, which Tom had always assumed was just a slightly unusual family name she'd stopped using professionally because it was difficult to spell. He had never once asked about it. He had never once been curious enough to ask. She moved into a rental apartment in Stamford, 2 bedrooms, unremarkable building, 3rd floor. Tom knew because his friend David had mentioned seeing the moving truck. He had felt a brief pang of something guilt, maybe, or the ghost of guilt, but he had pushed it down with the knowledge that she had agreed to the terms. She had chosen this. He hadn't taken anything from her. She had simply not asked for more. He told himself this many times in the weeks that followed. He told it to Jessica, who had moved into the Birchwood house with the certainty of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. He told it to his colleague Dan over beers after work. He told it to himself in the mirror on Tuesday mornings when the house felt too big and too quiet in all the wrong ways. She seemed happy enough, he told Dan, nursing his second IPA at the bar on Greenwich Avenue 3 weeks after the divorce was final. Honestly, I think she was just as ready as I was. Some people, they want the quiet life. She was always like that. Didn't want much. Simple person. Dan nodded, but something in his expression shifted just slightly, something Tom didn't catch. Sure, Dan said. Simple. At the house, things moved fast. Jessica had opinions about everything. The kitchen countertops needed to be marble, not granite. The master bath needed to be entirely gutted and redesigned. The backyard needed a stone patio and a pergola for summer entertaining. Tom, riding high on the feeling of a life finally matching his ambition, agreed to all of it. He hired contractors. He approved invoices. He took Jessica to Saks and to Neiman Marcus and told her she deserved the best. And he meant it in the way that people mean things when they are trying to convince themselves that an expensive choice is a correct one. His credit cards breathed out long and slow and steady. His savings account thinned at the edges. He told himself it was investment. He told himself you had to spend money to live the life you wanted. He told himself Rachel would have never understood any of this. The appetite for more, the refusal to settle, the unwillingness to be ordinary. He thought about Rachel sometimes late at night when Jessica was asleep. Not with longing, more with the particular brand of guilt that feels almost like satisfaction. The guilt of a man who believes he has made the right choice and wants the discomfort to confirm it. He imagined her in her Stamford apartment making soup, reading her paperbacks, working her hospital shifts, living her small and careful life. He felt sorry for her in his way. He told himself this was generous of him. What Tom Miller did not know, what he could not have known because he had never bothered to look, was that Rachel Vanderhoven had never been ordinary, not for a single day of her life. She had grown up between continents. Between two identities she had learned early to hold very quietly, because wealth announced loudly has a way of changing every room it enters. And Rachel had been taught by people who understood rooms. Her grandmother, Elise Vanderhoven, had built a European banking dynasty from the wreckage of post-war austerity, and her mother, Claudette, had expanded it with the kind of strategic patience that most people mistake for passivity. Rachel had been educated at institutions most Americans couldn't name. She had sat at tables with heads of state before she was 20. She had managed a charitable trust worth more than most people's entire concept of wealth before she turned 25. And then she had come to America for a residency program in nursing, because she had always believed that understanding suffering from the inside was more valuable than observing it from above. And she had met a sharp-eyed, handsome, laughing man at a charity gala who had asked her nothing about her last name. And she had thought, let's see who he really is. She had tested him quietly for 7 years, and he had failed. Not all at once, not dramatically, the way a foundation fails slowly, invisibly, in the places no one thinks to look. She had watched him choose ambition over kindness, surface over substance again and again in small ways and large ones, and she had stayed because she had wanted to be wrong about what she was seeing. She had loved him in the way that intelligent women sometimes love men who disappoint them with patience, with hope, with a specific kind of grief that never quite announces itself. When he sat across from her with his rehearsed speech and his borrowed moral framework and his barely concealed relief, she had made a choice in that same steady, windless way she made every choice. She would give him what he wanted. She would give him his clean break and his house and his lifestyle and his easy victory. She would restore her name and return to her life and let Tom Miller live inside his illusion for exactly as long as it took for the world to crack it open. She had signed the papers without crying, not because she didn't feel the grief of it. She did. She felt it all the way down, but because she had learned from women who were older and stronger than her that some griefs are yours alone to carry, and that carrying them quietly is not weakness. It is a particular kind of strength that looks like nothing at all until the moment it becomes everything. In her Stamford apartment, the night after the divorce was finalized, Rachel Vanderhoven sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea, the same kind of tea she had made in the Colonial on Birchwood Lane, and she picked up her phone and called her grandmother in Geneva. "It's done," she said, and Elise Vanderhoven's voice was 81 years old and entirely unweathered. "And I'm coming home for a few weeks," Rachel said, "and then I'm going to start the hospital project." "The one in your name?" "Yes," Rachel said, "in my name." There was a pause. Then her grandmother said, "Good girl," in the voice of a woman who had always known exactly who Rachel was and had waited a very long time to say so out loud. Tom Miller in the Colonial on Birchwood Lane was at that exact moment approving a $22,000 estimate for a new kitchen backsplash and telling Jessica that the wine she had chosen for dinner was perfect. He did not think about Rachel that night. He had moved on. He was certain of it. He would think about her soon enough. The world was about to make sure of that. 3 weeks after this divorce was finalized, Tom's colleague Marcus forwarded him an invitation to a Meridian Tech charity gala. Black tie, Manhattan, rooftop venue, the kind of event Tom lived, for the kind of room where careers advanced and impressions crystallized, and the right handshake at the right moment could mean everything. He went with Jessica on his arm. He wore his best suit. He felt powerful and present, and like a man whose story was going exactly where he had always intended it to go. He did not know that in 6 weeks, the name Rachel Vanderhoven would appear on the front page of Vanity Fair's annual philanthropy issue. He did not know that the photograph would show her not in scrubs, not in a modest blue dress, but in a perfectly fitted dove-gray suit, standing at the entrance of a newly funded children's cardiac wing at a hospital in Geneva, her hand on a ribbon, her face composed and luminous and absolutely certain of itself. He did not know any of this yet. But the thing about the truth is that it doesn't wait for you to be ready. It simply arrives. And Tom Miller's truth was already on its way. Back in Stamford, Rachel Vanderhoven unpacked the last of her boxes on a Wednesday afternoon in October. It didn't take long. She had always traveled light. She arranged her books on the shelf, made her bed with clean white linens, and stood at her kitchen window looking out at the parking lot and the gray October sky, and felt for the first time in a long time like herself. Her phone buzzed. A message from her cousin Henri from Zurich. A magazine had reached out wanting to profile her. Her foundation's new initiative was attracting significant attention in European financial circles. 3 separate charitable boards had extended invitations for her to join. And the hospital project, the Children's Cardiac Center she had been quietly funding for 2 years through a private trust, was almost ready for its public announcement. She typed back, "Handle the magazine. I'll be in Geneva by the 15th. She put the phone down and finished her tea. 20 minutes away on Birchwood Lane, a contractor's truck sat in the driveway. Tom Miller was arguing about load-bearing walls. He thought he had won. He thought he had left behind the simple, ordinary woman who had never asked for much. He had absolutely no idea what he had actually left behind. And that, as they say, is where the real story begins. Tom Miller woke up the morning after the divorce was finalized, feeling like a man who had just crossed a finish line. He stretched across the king-sized bed in the Colonial on Birchwood Lane, looked up at the ceiling, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, uncomplicated. Clean, like a spreadsheet with every column finely balanced. He told himself this was peace. He told himself this was what he had been working toward. He got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard. He now owned entirely, without compromise, without negotiation, without Rachel's quiet presence, softening every corner of every room. He told himself he didn't miss that softness. He told himself he had outgrown it. Jessica arrived at 9 with 2 suitcases and a vision board. He hadn't expected the vision board. She spread it out on the kitchen table, the same table where Rachel had signed the papers, and pointed at images she had cut from interior design magazines. Marble countertops, a 6-burner range, a master bath with a freestanding tub and heated floors, a pergola in the backyard strung with Edison lights. "This is what this house could be," Jessica said, her eyes bright, her voice full of the particular energy of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something out loud. "Tom, this place has incredible bones. We just need to make it ours." Tom looked at the vision board. Then he looked at Jessica, and he thought about Rachel's kitchen, the one she had kept perfectly functional and entirely unpretentious, the one that had always smelled like whatever she was cooking for a dinner he was usually too late to eat. He pushed the thought away. "Let's do it," he said. "Whatever it takes." Those 4 words would cost him more than he was capable of calculating that morning. The first contractor came out on a Thursday. His estimate for the kitchen alone was $41,000. Tom signed the proposal without blinking because blinking would have meant hesitating, and hesitating would have meant doubt, and Tom Miller did not do doubt. He called his bank the next morning and moved money from his savings into checking with the casual confidence of a man who believed there would always be more money coming. There had always been more money coming. That was the story Tom told himself about his own life, and he had told it so many times, it had stopped being a story and started feeling like a law of nature. Jessica thanked him with a smile that made him feel briefly like the man he was trying to be, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. Meanwhile, in Stamford, Rachel Vanderhoven was on a call with her attorney in Geneva. "The trust paperwork is ready," the attorney, a meticulous Swiss man named Bernard Kessler, said through the phone. "Once you give the word, we can begin the public-facing phase of the foundation. The hospital wing naming ceremony is scheduled for March. Vanity Fair has confirmed their photographer." "And the board restructuring?" Rachel asked. She was standing at her kitchen counter in her Stamford apartment, still in her hospital scrubs, eating a bowl of plain yogurt with one hand and holding the phone with the other. "Complete," Bernard said. "You'll assume formal chairmanship of the Vanderhoven Foundation at the January meeting in Zurich. Your grandmother has already signed the transition documents." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "How much is liquid right now, Bernard, accessible if I need it?" "Just over $112 million personally. The Foundation's operating assets are separate, of course." "Of course," Rachel said. She put down her spoon. "Okay, let's move forward." She hung up and finished her yogurt. Then she picked up her hospital bag because she had a night shift in 4 hours, and Rachel Vanderhoven had never once in her life used wealth as an excuse to stop working. Back in Greenwich, Tom had no idea that conversation had just taken place. He was at dinner with his colleague Dan Reeves at a steakhouse on Greenwich Avenue, 2 glasses into a bottle of Cabernet, talking about the renovation timeline and the upcoming Meridian Tech 4th quarter push. Dan was one of Tom's oldest friends at the firm, the kind of man who laughed easily and listened carefully and had always known Tom well enough to say the things Tom didn't want to hear, though he usually chose not to. Tonight, Dan chose. "Can I ask you something?" Dan said, cutting into his steak, not looking up. "Go ahead," Tom said. "Did you ever actually know anything about Rachel's family?" Tom set down his glass. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what do you know about where she came from, her background, her family in Europe?" Tom shrugged. "She mentioned her family was from Belgium or somewhere, some banking history. Old money, she said once, but she didn't act like it. You know how she was, low-key about everything." He picked up his glass again. "Why—" Dan looked at him for a moment with an expression that Tom would remember later, something between concern and the particular discomfort of a man who knows something he isn't sure he should say. "No reason," Dan finally said. "Just curious." "She's fine, Dan. She's got her apartment, she's got her job, she's exactly where she wants to be." Tom said it with the certainty of a man who needs the sentence to be true. Some people are just built for simpler lives. Dan nodded slowly. "Sure," he said. "Sure, Tom." He didn't say anything else about it that night, but he didn't finish his wine either. 6 weeks passed, the way weeks pass when a man is busy spending money he hasn't quite accounted for. The kitchen renovation ran over budget by $11,000 when they discovered the subfloor needed replacement. The master bath addition required a permit that delayed everything by 3 weeks and added another $8,000 in architectural fees. Jessica wanted custom cabinetry. The contractor said custom meant an extra $14,000. Tom approved it. Tom approved everything, because the alternative was admitting that the numbers were moving in a direction he didn't like. And Tom Miller was not a man who admitted things easily. Jessica noticed the shift before he did. She wasn't careless with money exactly. She simply had no framework for understanding that Tom's financial position was not what it looked like from the outside. She had seen the house, the car, the suits, the dinners, and she had constructed a picture of Tom's wealth that was flattering and inaccurate. She was not cruel. She was simply working from the information available to her, and Tom had never corrected it, because correcting it would have meant telling the truth, and the truth in those weeks was something Tom kept in a drawer and didn't open. At night, sometimes he would lie awake running numbers in his head. Savings balance minus renovation costs, minus Jessica's wardrobe, minus the dinners, minus the wine, minus the monthly nut on the house, which had been manageable when there were 2 incomes and was now somewhat less manageable with 1. The numbers would start clear and get foggy somewhere around 2 in the morning, and he would tell himself he was being anxious, that anxious men made bad decisions, that the Meridian Tech year-end bonus would cover the gap, and then some. He believed this. He needed to believe it. It was a Tuesday morning in November when his assistant Carly knocked on his office door and said with the particular careful tone of someone delivering bad news they've been sitting on, "Tom Marcus from Finance is asking if you've had a chance to review the Q4 projection email." Tom had not reviewed the Q4 projection email. He pulled it up on his screen and read it twice and then a third time, and the comfortable certainty he had been carrying since October developed its first visible crack. The year-end bonus pool had been restructured. His portion, which he had been mentally counting on at roughly $90,000, had been recalculated based on departmental performance metrics that had shifted in Q3. His actual bonus would be closer to $31,000 before taxes. Tom sat very still in his office chair. $31,000 before taxes, when the renovation tab was already sitting at $67,000 and climbing. When 3 credit cards were carrying balances he had planned to clear with the bonus. When the mortgage on the Colonial had this month felt for the first time in 4 years like a weight rather than a point of pride. He closed the email. He opened it again. He closed it again. He called Jessica from his office with the door shut. "Hey," he said when she picked up. "The bonus situation. It's a little different than I expected." "Different how?" Her voice was careful. "I'm still working through the numbers," he said. "Can we maybe pause on the pergola quote for now, just for a few weeks?" There was a pause on her end that lasted just long enough to mean something. "Of course," she said in the tone of a woman who is agreeing to something she does not agree to. "Whatever you need." Tom hung up and stared at his desk. He thought about Rachel for the first time in weeks, not with sentiment, but with something stranger. He thought about how she had never once in 7 years asked him where the money was going. He thought about how she had managed the household budget with a quietness that had seemed boring to him at the time and now, in retrospect, looked like a form of genius. He pushed the thought away almost immediately. He was not going to sit in his office and feel nostalgic about his ex-wife's financial competence. That was not where this story was going. He picked up his phone and called his financial advisor instead. The conversation lasted 22 minutes and left him feeling worse than before he'd made it. In Stamford, Rachel was having a very different kind of Tuesday. She had just returned from Geneva, where she had spent 2 weeks finalizing the transition documents with Bernard and meeting with the Vanderhoven Foundation's board of directors. She had toured the children's cardiac wing, met with the surgical team, and stood in the half-finished corridor of what would soon be named the Elise Vanderhoven Pediatric Center, and felt the kind of purpose that settles into your bones and stays there. Her cousin Henri had met her for dinner on her last night in Geneva. He was 37, lean and bright-eyed, and the only member of her family who had ever truly understood why she had gone to America and lived the way she had lived there. "Are you ready?" he asked her. "For all of it to become public." Rachel turned her wine glass slowly on the tablecloth. "Yes," she said. "I think I've been ready for a while." "And Henri paused diplomatically. "The divorce situation, does that complicate anything legally?" "No," Rachel said simply. "I made sure of that before I signed anything. The settlement protects both parties from future claims. He gets nothing of mine, and I owe nothing of his. It's clean." Henri looked at her with the slightly awed expression he had been wearing since they were children, when Rachel had a habit of thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. "You knew this was coming," he said. "Even then, when you signed." Rachel looked at him calmly. "I knew who I was," she said. "I just let him believe something different." Henri laughed a short, genuine sound of admiration. "Grandmère was right about you." "Grandmère is right about most things," Rachel said and smiled and finished her wine. Back in Greenwich, Tom was not smiling. He was sitting across from Jessica at the kitchen table, the new marble-topped kitchen table that had arrived last week and cost more than Rachel's monthly rent, and the conversation they were having was not going the way he had hoped. "I just think we need to be realistic," Tom said. "The bonus was lower than expected, the renovation costs went over, and I need a few months to stabilize before we do anything else." Jessica's expression had moved through several phases in the last 5 minutes. Surprise, calculation, something that looked uncomfortably like disappointment. "When you say stabilize," she said carefully, "what exactly does that mean?" "It means I need to pause spending for a bit. No more renovations. Scale back on dining out. Maybe hold off on the trip to Aspen." Jessica set down her fork. "Tom, we already told David and Claire we'd be there for New Year's." "I know," Tom said. "I know, and I'm sorry. But I have to be honest with you about where things stand." She looked at him across the new marble table in the newly gutted kitchen that still smelled like drywall compound, and Tom could see her rearranging something behind her eyes, updating a calculation, adjusting a picture. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "It's not bad," Tom said immediately, because saying it was bad was not something he was capable of yet. "It's just tighter than I planned. It'll correct itself." Jessica nodded slowly. She picked her fork back up. She ate in silence for a while. Then she said, "Okay," in the same tone Rachel had once used, and something about that particular intonation, that flat and careful okay, sent a small, cold current through Tom's chest that he could not explain and did not examine. He slept poorly that night. He lay awake running numbers again, and this time the numbers were harder to make fuzzy, and when he finally drifted off somewhere after 3, he dreamed about Rachel's kitchen, the old one before the renovation, the one that had always been warm. He woke up and told himself it meant nothing. November became December. Tom's credit card statements arrived in his inbox with the quiet regularity of bad news that has stopped trying to be subtle. He paid minimums on 2 of them. He deferred a contractor's final invoice. He told his financial advisor he was managing it. He told Jessica things were looking up. He told himself the same. The gap between what Tom Miller said and what was actually true had become a place he was spending an enormous amount of energy maintaining, and the maintenance was beginning to show in the lines around his eyes and the way he sometimes stopped mid-sentence at work and had to find his place again. His assistant Carly noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed. His boss Richard Harmon noticed too. Richard was the kind of executive who tracked people the way a diagnostician tracks symptoms quietly, consistently, without announcing his findings. He had watched Tom Miller for 4 years with steady approval. In December, he began watching him with something more careful. At the company holiday party, Richard pulled Tom aside near the bar and said with the directness of a man who had not gotten to his position by being indirect, "Everything all right with you, Tom? You seem distracted." "I'm fine," Tom said. "Just a busy quarter." "Your Q4 close was 2 points under projection," Richard said. "First time in 3 years." "I'm aware," Tom said. "I'll have it corrected in Q1. Richard looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Good," he said. Then he moved away back into the party, and Tom stood at the bar alone and felt the particular isolation of a man whose carefully constructed image has developed a hairline fracture that only he can see, but that everyone else is beginning to notice the outline of. He ordered another drink. He checked his phone. Nothing from Jessica, who had told him she was going to her friend Lauren's holiday dinner. Nothing from anyone that mattered. He thought about calling Dan, but Dan had been strange lately, careful with his words, in a way that felt like he was holding something back, and Tom wasn't in the mood for careful. He did not know that Dan had 2 days earlier seen a brief online piece in a European financial news aggregator, the kind of site that tracked old money family business with the dry precision of a legal gazette. The piece mentioned the upcoming public announcement of the Vanderhoven Foundation's expansion and the formal appointment of Rachel Vanderhoven as chairwoman, and included a single photograph of a woman that Dan had recognized immediately because he had met her at Tom's company picnic 3 summers ago, and she had been kind to his daughter, and he had never forgotten it. Dan had read the article twice. Then he had closed his laptop and sat very still for a long time, thinking about the dinner at the steakhouse and the question he had asked, and the answer Tom had given him. Simple life. Some people are built for simpler lives. Dan had thought about calling Tom. He had decided against it. Some things a man needs to arrive at on his own, and Dan Reeves was wise enough to know that delivering this particular piece of news to Tom Miller would accomplish nothing except possibly getting himself shot as the messenger. He kept the article in a saved folder on his browser. He told himself he would know when the time was right. Christmas came and went on Birchwood Lane with the strained cheerfulness of people who are working hard not to discuss the thing they are both thinking about. Tom bought Jessica a bracelet that went on the last card with available credit. She gave him a cashmere robe and a look across the breakfast table that contained, if he had been paying attention, a question she had not yet decided to ask out loud. January arrived cold and clear, the way January arrives in Connecticut when it means business. Tom's Q1 targets landed in his inbox on the 2nd, and they were steeper than last year's. And Richard Harmon had added a note at the bottom that said simply, "Let's make this the comeback quarter." Tom read the note and felt it land somewhere between motivation and threat, which was probably exactly where Richard had intended it to land. He went to the office on January 3rd with the particular determination of a man trying to outrun something he can't name. He worked late. He skipped lunch. He sent 14 emails before noon. He was in the way that matters on a surface level, trying very hard. What Tom Miller did not know on that cold January morning was that on the other side of the Atlantic, in a glass and stone conference room in Zurich, Rachel Vanderhoven was seated at the head of a long table, assuming formal chairmanship of a foundation whose assets dwarfed the GDP of several small nations. She was wearing a charcoal suit. Her grandmother sat to her right, 81 years old and sharp as a surgical blade, watching her granddaughter take the chair with an expression of undisguised pride. 30 people were in that room: attorneys, board members, financial directors, the editor of a major European philanthropic publication, and every single one of them was watching Rachel with the kind of attention that power commands when it finally stops pretending to be ordinary. Rachel signed the chairmanship documents with the same pen she carried everywhere, the same plain black pen she had used 4 months ago in a conference room above a dry cleaner on Greenwich Avenue to sign her name on a divorce settlement that Tom Miller had considered his greatest victory. She set the pen down. She looked around the table, and she said in a voice that carried the particular quiet authority of someone who has never needed to raise it, "Let's begin." In Greenwich, Tom Miller was arguing with a credit card company about a late fee. The world was already turning. He just hadn't felt it yet. The credit card company waived the late fee. It took Tom 23 minutes on the phone, and by the end of it, he had deployed charm, mild indignation, and finally a weary reasonableness that had worked. And he hung up feeling the small, hollow victory of a man who has just saved $39 while bleeding out from a wound he refuses to look at directly. He told Carly to hold his calls for an hour. He sat in his office with the door closed and stared at the wall and did something he almost never did. He added up the actual numbers. He used a legal pad, old habit from his analyst days when spreadsheets felt too clean for ugly math. He wrote down every balance, every monthly obligation, every deferred payment, every card, every contractor invoice still outstanding. He wrote slowly. When he finished, he looked at what he had written for a long time without moving. The number at the bottom of the page was not catastrophic, not yet, but it was close enough to catastrophic that the distance between where he was and where he could not come back from was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. It had a shape. He folded the legal pad in half and put it in his desk drawer and did not open it again for 2 weeks. This was a very Tom Miller thing to do. Tom. February arrived and the renovation contractors came back for their final punch list walkthrough. The pergola was done, the kitchen was done, the master bath was done. The house looked extraordinary, genuinely extraordinary, the kind of home that photographed like a magazine spread and felt when you walked through it like the physical evidence of success. Tom stood in the finished kitchen and felt a surge of pride so strong it almost drowned out the number on the legal pad. Almost. Jessica walked through each room slowly, touching surfaces, opening drawers, running her hand along the marble countertops she had chosen. She turned to Tom in the master bath doorway and said, "It's perfect. It's really perfect, Tom." and she kissed him with the enthusiasm of a woman who is genuinely happy in this moment, and Tom held on to that moment the way a man holds onto a railing in bad weather, both hands full grip. That evening Dan Reeves called. Tom almost didn't pick up. He was opening a bottle of wine with Jessica, and the evening had the tentative warmth of a ceasefire after weeks of careful distance, and he didn't want to break the spell. But Dan had called twice in a row, which was not like Dan, and Tom stepped out into the hallway and answered. "Hey," Dan said. His voice had the particular quality of a man who has been sitting with something for a long time and has finally decided he can't sit with it anymore. "Are you somewhere you can talk? Give me a second." Tom walked to his home office and closed the door. "What's going on?" "I need to show you something," Dan said. "I've been sitting on this for a while because I wasn't sure. I didn't want to be the one to—" He stopped. "Tom, just check your email. I'm sending you a link right now." Tom heard the ping of an incoming message. He pulled up his email on his desktop. The subject line from Dan was blank. The body of the email contained a single URL link to an article from a European financial news outlet he had never heard of. The headline was in English. It read, "Vanderhoven Foundation announces expansion. Rachel Vanderhoven, named chairwoman in Zurich transition ceremony." Tom clicked the link. The article loaded slowly the way things load when your Wi-Fi is being used for a streaming service in the next room. He read the first paragraph, then he scrolled down and saw the photograph. Rachel, in a charcoal suit seated at the head of a long conference table, her hands folded in front of her, 30 people watching her with the focused attention of people in the presence of someone who matters enormously. She looked calm. She looked like herself. She looked, Tom thought, like a woman who had never once in her life been ordinary. He read the whole article. It took 4 minutes. When he finished, he sat in his office chair and did not move for a long time. "Tom," Dan said from the phone which Tom had forgotten he was holding. "You still there?" "Yeah," Tom said. His voice came out strangely flat. "Yeah, I'm here." "I found it back in January," Dan said. "I didn't know how to say." "January," Tom repeated. "You've known since January." "I didn't know what to do with it, man. I'm sorry." Tom was quiet. In the other room, he could hear Jessica laughing at something on television. The sound was very far away. "How big is the foundation?" he asked, because his brain had gone to numbers the way it always went to numbers when everything else was too large to process. "The article says the operating assets are separate from personal holdings," Dan said carefully. "But there's a reference to her personal liquid position in a profile piece I found from a Swiss financial magazine. Tom, it's over 100 million, personally." Tom said nothing. "And that's not counting the family banking dynasty. The Vanderhoven name in European banking is Tom, it's generational. It's billions, with a B." Tom set the phone down on his desk without ending the call. He could hear Dan saying his name small and tinny from the speaker. He stood up. He walked to his office window. He thought about the dinner table in October, the papers sliding across the surface, her hand picking up the pen, her steadiness, her absolute unshakable steadiness that he had interpreted as defeat. And that was, he now understood with a clarity so sharp it was almost physical, nothing of the kind. She had known. She had known exactly who she was and exactly what she was walking away from and exactly what she was walking toward, and she had signed those papers without a single flicker of anxiety, because to Rachel Vanderhoven, Tom Miller's victory had never been real. It had been permitted. She had allowed him to feel it. She had handed it to him the way you hand a child a toy to keep them quiet while the adults conduct serious business in the next room. He picked the phone back up. "Dan," he said. "The nursing thing, the job at Greenwich Hospital, was that real?" Dan was quiet for a moment. "I think so. From what I can tell, she genuinely worked there. 4 years, full shifts." "Why?" Tom asked. And what he meant was, why would a woman with $100 million in liquid assets work night shifts in a Connecticut hospital? But what came out was just that single word, small and bewildered. "I think," Dan said slowly, "that's just who she is." Tom ended the call. He stood in his office in the house he had renovated with money he didn't have in the life he had constructed, on the premise that he had outsmarted a simple woman, and felt the specific vertigo of a man whose entire narrative of himself has just been inverted without warning. He did not sleep that night. He told Jessica he had a headache. She believed him, or chose to. He lay in the dark listening to her breathe and stared at the ceiling and tried to reconstruct every memory of Rachel through this new lens, and found to his growing horror that every single thing he had dismissed as evidence of her ordinariness was in fact evidence of something else entirely. Her quietness was not emptiness. Her patience was not passivity. Her refusal to argue about money was not because she didn't understand it. It was because she understood it so completely, so fundamentally, that his version of it, his bonuses, his portfolios, his renovation budgets, were to her approximately what a child's piggy bank is to a Federal Reserve chairman. At 3 a.m, he opened his phone and searched her name. Rachel Vanderhoven. The results came back immediately, and they kept coming, page after page, a whole life she had lived in, parallel with the quiet life he thought he knew. Foundation boards, hospital funding announcements, a profile in a Belgian financial magazine from 6 years ago. 6 years ago, when they were still married, that described her as one of the most quietly influential philanthropists in European financial circles. There was a photograph from a charity event in Brussels, dated 4 years into their marriage, where she was standing next to a European commissioner and smiling the same calm smile she had worn every morning over coffee in his kitchen. He had thought that smile meant she was content. He had thought it meant she was simple. It meant neither of those things. It meant she had already decided who she was, and no one else's opinion of her was going to change it. He put his phone face down on the nightstand and lay in the dark for the rest of the night, not sleeping. 3 days later, the Vanity Fair issue hit newsstands. Tom found out about it the way he found out about most things that mattered too late from someone else in public, without any time to prepare his face. He was in the quarterly board meeting at Meridian Tech's Manhattan office. 12 people around the table. Richard Harmon at the head, when his colleague Peter Sato slid a magazine across the table toward him during the break with the careful neutrality of a man delivering a grenade. "Isn't that your ex-wife?" Peter said. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone is pretending not to pay attention while paying extremely close attention. Tom looked down at the magazine. The Vanity Fair philanthropy issue. The cover featured 3 people, and Rachel was second from the left in the dove gray suit, her hair pulled back. Her expression the composed and slightly distant look of someone who has been photographed professionally enough times to be comfortable with it. The headline above her read, "Rachel Vanderhoven, the quiet architect of a new kind of wealth." Tom's hand did not shake. He was proud of this, later in the hollow way of small victories. His hand did not shake when he picked up the magazine. His hand did not shake when he opened to the profile page 47, which began with a quote from her grandmother, and moved into a 14-page spread detailing Rachel's life, her family's banking legacy, her years in nursing, and the Vanderhoven Foundation's newly announced $100 million hospital endowment. He read the first 3 paragraphs. That was all he managed before Richard Harmon said, "Shall we reconvene?" And Tom had to put the magazine down and sit upright and look like a functioning executive. He looked like a functioning executive for the remaining 40 minutes of the meeting. This required more effort than anything he had done professionally in the past year. Afterward, when the room had emptied, he sat alone at the conference table for a few minutes, the magazine in front of him, and read the rest of the profile. There was a line near the end of the piece that hit him like a flat hand to the chest. The journalist had asked Rachel what she had learned from her time in America. Rachel had said, in the careful and precise way she said everything, "I learned that people reveal themselves most clearly in the moments when they believe they're winning. When someone thinks they have the upper hand, they stop performing. That's when you see who they actually are." Tom read the sentence twice. Then he closed the magazine and left it on the conference table. He did not take it with him. He did not want it in his office or his car or his house. He walked to the elevator and rode it down 30 floors in silence and stood on the sidewalk outside the building in the February cold and did something he had not done since he was 19 years old and had just found out he hadn't gotten into his first choice school. He stood on the sidewalk and breathed, just breathed, because it was the only thing available to him. His phone began buzzing within the hour, colleagues who had seen the issue. A former business school classmate who texted, "Dude, seriously." She was that Rachel Vanderhoven. People who had met Rachel at company events at holiday parties at the charity gala, where Tom had always introduced her as my wife. A nurse good with people, said it in the tone of a man proud of his tolerance for simplicity, who were now texting and calling with a barely concealed incredulity that had underneath it a judgment Tom could feel even through a screen. He answered none of them. He drove back to Greenwich. He kept both hands on the wheel and both eyes on the road and told himself he was fine. He was fine. This changed nothing. He had moved on. He had a renovated house and a relationship and a career, and the fact that his ex-wife had turned out to be a billionaire heiress was simply a surprising piece of information that had no material bearing on his current life. He believed this for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, Jessica was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open when he came home from work. She looked up. Her expression was the one he had come to recognize as the prelude to a conversation he didn't want to have. "I saw the Vanity Fair piece," she said. Tom set down his bag. "Jessica, I'm not angry," she said, which meant she was angry in the precise and directed way of a woman who has decided anger is less useful than clarity. "I'm just trying to understand something. You told me she was a nurse. You said she was simple. You said she was fine with the settlement because she didn't need more. Tom, she has $100 million. The settlement was her idea," Tom said. "She chose those terms." "I know that," Jessica said. "That's actually the part that keeps bothering me." She paused. "She chose to take almost nothing from you. Why would a woman worth that much choose to take almost nothing?" Tom didn't answer, because the answer was something he had been sitting with for 5 days and was not ready to say out loud. The answer was because she didn't need anything from me. Not a single thing. She never had. She was not leaving a marriage with nothing. She was leaving a marriage with everything she'd had before it, everything she'd built in spite of it and her name, which was worth more than his entire net worth, times a number he didn't want to calculate. "I don't know," Tom said instead. Jessica looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed her laptop and said, "I'm going to stay at Lauren's tonight. I need to think." She packed a bag. She was polite about it, efficient, careful. She kissed him on the cheek at the door, and the kiss had the quality of something final, wearing the costume of something temporary. Tom stood in the kitchen after she left and listened to the silence of the house and did not pour himself a drink, which cost him something. He called Dan. "She's going to leave," Tom said. No preamble, no hello. Dan was quiet for a beat. "Did she say that—" "She didn't have to." Tom sat down on the kitchen floor with his back against the marble island, because sometimes a man's body finds its own level. "Dan, what did I do?" "Tom." "No, I'm asking, seriously, what did I actually do here?" His voice was not steady now. It had been steady in the board meeting and steady when Jessica walked out, and it had used up all its steadiness, and now it was just what it was. "I had a good woman. I had a genuinely good woman who never lied to me, never manipulated me, never made me feel small, and I sat across from her at that table, and I shoved papers at her and told her to sign and disappear, and she did it. She did it because she's the kind of person who keeps her word even when the other person doesn't deserve it." Dan said nothing. This was the right choice. "And now the whole world knows who she is," Tom said, "and who I am. And the gap between those two things is—" He stopped. "Tom," Dan said carefully, "what do you need right now?" "I don't know," Tom said. And this was true. For possibly the first time in his adult life, Tom Miller genuinely did not know what he needed, because all the strategies he had ever used to get what he needed were built on a confidence in his own judgment that had over the past week been quietly dismantled from the inside out. He sat on the kitchen floor for a while longer. The house was quiet around him. The beautiful, renovated, nearly unaffordable house. He thought about the legal pad in his desk drawer, the number at the bottom. He thought about Rachel in the boardroom in Zurich, hands folded, 30 people watching, that particular stillness of hers which he had mistaken for so many things and had finally too late identified correctly. It wasn't passivity. It wasn't simplicity. It wasn't defeat. It was the stillness of someone who already knew exactly how the story ended, who had always known, who had sat across from him on the night he asked for the divorce and looked at him with those steady brown eyes and thought something she would never say to him, something she would never need to say to him because the world was already in the process of saying it for her. Tom Miller got up off the kitchen floor. He poured himself a glass of water. He looked at his reflection in the dark window above the sink, older than he thought. He looked more tired, less certain, and he held that gaze for 3 seconds before he looked away. In Stamford, Rachel Vanderhoven was not thinking about Tom. She was on a video call with the surgical team at the Children's Cardiac Center in Geneva, reviewing the timeline for the opening ceremony. The room on her screen was full of doctors who were going to save children's lives with equipment she had paid for, and she was asking them precise and knowledgeable questions, and they were answering her with the respect that people reserve for someone who has earned it at the level of character rather than title. When the call ended, she sat quietly for a moment. Her phone showed 17 new messages, most of them from people who had seen the Vanity Fair piece. She scrolled through them, without opening most of them. She had learned early that public recognition, like public dismissal, said more about the people doing the recognizing than it did about the person being recognized. She had simply been herself the entire time. The world was just now paying attention. She set her phone down. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table and opened a new chapter of her paperback, the same one she had been reading the night Tom had come home with his rehearsed speech and his borrowed morality and his absolute conviction that he was winning. She read 3 pages. Then she smiled at something in the text, not connected to Tom, not connected to Vanity Fair, not connected to any of it, just something a character had said that she found true and funny and human. Outside February was doing what February does in Connecticut. Cold, relentless, indifferent to everyone's plans. Tom Miller was inside his beautiful house alone, staring at a legal pad. The number at the bottom had not changed. The world around it had. Jessica came back on a Thursday morning. Tom heard her key in the lock and felt something loosen in his chest, relief, or the anticipation of relief, and then he saw her face and understood that the loosening had been premature. She was carrying the overnight bag she had taken to Lauren's, but she was also carrying something in her expression that had the weight and finality of a decision already made and not subject to revision. She set the bag down by the door. She did not take off her coat. "I've been thinking," she said. "Jessica, let me finish." She said it quietly without heat, and something about the quietness reminded Tom of a woman he was trying very hard not to think about, and the reminder landed in his sternum like a thumb pressed hard against a bruise. "I've been thinking about what I actually know about you, what I knew before the Vanity Fair thing, and what I know now. And Tom, I'm not leaving because she's rich. I want to be clear about that. I'm leaving because of what her being rich revealed about you." Tom stood very still. "What does that mean?" "It means that you talked about her like she was nothing," Jessica said. Her voice was steady, not cruel steady in the way of someone delivering a truth they have rehearsed and believe completely. "You told me she was simple, unambitious, that she didn't want more because she couldn't imagine more. You said it with this—" She paused, searching for the word, "this pity, like you felt sorry for her. And I believed you. I built my understanding of your marriage on what you told me about her. And what you told me was wrong. Not just factually wrong. Wrong in the way that says something about how you see people." Tom opened his mouth, closed it. "If you were wrong about her," Jessica said, "what are you wrong about me?" The question sat in the room between them like a physical object. Tom could not answer it, not because he didn't have words, but because every word he reached for was either a lie or an admission, and he was standing in a kitchen that had cost him $60,000. He didn't have talking to a woman he had pursued with the same confidence that had governed every catastrophically wrong decision he had made in the past 18 months, and the ground beneath all of it had simply stopped being solid. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. For possibly the first time in this entire sequence of events, he meant something without calculation underneath it. Jessica looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were sad in a way that wasn't angry, which was somehow worse. "I know you are," she said. She picked up her bag. "I'll get the rest of my things this weekend. Lauren said I can stay as long as I need." She left. The door closed behind her with a soft click that had none of the drama Tom had always associated with endings. No slam, no raised voices, just a click, and then silence. And then Tom Miller alone in his renovated house with the marble countertops and the heated bathroom floors and the Edison lights on the pergola in the backyard that no one was going to sit under now that winter had arrived properly, and the relationship it had been built for had just walked out the front door in a gray coat. He sat down at the kitchen table. He did not move for a long time. It was Dan who called him out of it 40 minutes later, because Dan had the particular radar of a good friend for the moments when silence from Tom meant something had gone wrong. "How are you doing?" Dan asked, which was code for "I already know something happened, tell me." "She left," Tom said. A pause. "Tonight. Just now." Another pause longer. "Come over," Dan said. "Karen's making dinner. Just come over." Tom almost said no. He was very practiced at saying no to things that required him to be in a room with people who knew him well enough to see past his performance. But the house was quiet in a way that had a texture to it, a weight. And Tom picked up his keys and drove to Dan's house in the dark and sat at Dan and Karen's kitchen table eating pasta he barely tasted while Dan talked about work and Karen talked about their daughter's school play, and neither of them asked him about Jessica or Rachel or Vanity Fair or any of it, and the simple human mercy of that carried him through the evening. Walking to his car afterward, Dan came with him. They stood in the driveway in the February cold. Dan put his hands in his coat pockets. "Richard called me today," Dan said carefully. Tom turned. "Harmon, about what?" "About Q1 targets, and about you." Dan looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. "Tom, he's watching. I don't think your position is as solid as you think it is right now." Tom felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with February. He said that he didn't have to. "I've known Richard for 11 years. When he calls to discuss someone's Q1 targets with their colleague instead of directly with them, it means he's already made a decision and he's building the paperwork around it." Dan held his gaze. "I'm telling you because you need to know, not to scare you, because you need to get it together at work, Tom. Whatever is happening in the rest of your life, work has to hold." Tom nodded. He felt the nod before he made it. Felt it as a mechanical response from a body that was running on reflex, because the part of him that made considered choices had been temporarily offline since a Thursday evening in February, when the person he had believed was his victory had turned out to be his most complete and lasting miscalculation. "Thank you," Tom said. He drove home. He sat in the Colonial on Birchwood Lane and opened the legal pad from his desk drawer and looked at the number at the bottom and for the first time did not close it again. He sat with it. He let it be real. The renovation debt the card balances the mortgage running on a single income that was itself becoming uncertain, the bonus that had already disappointed once and showed no structural reason to improve. He wrote new numbers next to the old ones. Updated figures. He had been avoiding this arithmetic the way you avoid a doctor's call when you already know the diagnosis, but avoidance had a ceiling and he had found it. The number was bad. Not unsurvivable, but bad in the way that requires immediate action and sustained discipline and the complete abandonment of the lifestyle he had built to prove something to himself and had instead used to accelerate his own unraveling. He made a list, not a legal pad list. This time a real one on his laptop, typed slowly, because typing slowly forces a different kind of honesty than writing fast. He listed every expense that could be cut, every asset that could be liquidated. The pergola furniture still in boxes, the cases of wine in the basement rack, expensive bottles Jessica had chosen, the second car he barely drove. He would need to talk to a financial advisor, a real conversation this time, not the managed presentation he had given in January. He would need to be honest about where the numbers actually were. He hit send on an email to his financial advisor at 11:47 at night, requesting an urgent meeting. Then he closed the laptop and sat in the quiet and let the quiet be what it was. March arrived. The urgent meeting with the financial advisor, a methodical woman named Carol Huang, who had been telling Tom to moderate his spending for 2 years in the careful language of professional restraint, was now conducted in the language of professional alarm. She spread his accounts across her screen and was quiet for a moment in the way that financial advisors are quiet when they are deciding how honest to be. She decided to be very honest. "Tom," she said, "you need to sell the house." He had known it was coming. He had known it the way you know a storm is coming, when the pressure in the air changes and the birds go quiet. He had known it, and still the sentence landed like something dropped from a height. "The mortgage is serviceable in isolation," Carol continued, "but the renovation debt, the card balances, and your current income trajectory create a situation where you will be in default within 18 months if nothing changes. Selling now while the market is favorable and the renovations add value gives you the best chance of coming out even. Maybe slightly ahead." "Slightly ahead," Tom repeated. "It's better than foreclosure," Carol said, with the gentleness of a woman who has had to say this to people before and has learned that gentleness doesn't make it smaller, but does make it bearable. Tom looked at the numbers on her screen. The Colonial on Birchwood Lane, with its marble countertops and heated floors, and the pergola out back strung with Edison lights, appraised now at a value that was real and solid, and meant almost nothing to him as a number because it represented not an asset, but a confession. He had bought the renovation and the lifestyle, and the expensive wine as evidence of his superiority over a life he had left. And the life he had left had turned out to be the life of a woman with more resources in her personal checking account than the appraised value of his house times 12. "Okay," Tom said. "Let's list it." Carol nodded. She pulled up a contact list for a realtor she trusted. The efficiency of her movements had the quality of relief she had been waiting for Tom to arrive at this conclusion, and was glad the wait was over. Tom drove home from that meeting and stood in the kitchen for a long time. He touched the marble countertop. He thought about the night Jessica had walked through the finished renovation and said, "It's perfect. It's really perfect, Tom." He thought about the way he had felt in that moment, standing in his beautiful house, with a woman who had chosen him, feeling for the first time in months that the story he was telling about himself was holding together. It had not held together. Stories built on wrong foundations never do. He called a realtor that afternoon. The house went on the market on the 15th of March. At Meridian Tech, the thing Dan had warned him about was developing in the particular corporate way of these things, gradually, then suddenly. Richard Harmon's manner toward Tom had shifted by degrees so small that someone less experienced might have missed them. But Tom had spent enough years in professional environments to read the weather of a room, and the weather in every room Richard occupied had turned distinctly cooler where Tom was concerned. Meetings Tom had previously led were quietly restructured. His input on a key client strategy was politely redirected. A project he had been developing for 6 months was assigned a co-lead without prior discussion. A junior director named Alyssa Park, who was talented and ambitious, and whose presence on the project meant something Tom did not want to translate directly. He translated it directly anyway in the car on the way home from work, because men like Tom Miller are eventually forced to read the signs they have been ignoring, and March was apparently the month for forced readings. He called Dan from the car. "Alyssa Park," he said, no preamble. Dan was quiet for exactly 1 beat too long. "Dan, I heard about it this morning," Dan said carefully. "Is this what I think it is?" Another beat. "Richard is restructuring the division. It's not just you. There are 3 other senior roles being evaluated." "That's not a no," Tom said. "Tom, I think you need to have a direct conversation with Richard. I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I think you should have that conversation sooner rather than later." Tom requested the meeting the next morning. Richard agreed to Friday at 10. The 4 days between the request and the meeting were the longest 4 days Tom had experienced since he could remember, because every hour of them was occupied by a precise and unrelenting awareness of how far the distance was between where he had believed himself to be and where he actually was. He had believed he was winning. He had believed this with such conviction and for such an extended period that the belief had become structural load-bearing, the thing everything else leaned on. And now the structure was being disassembled piece by piece in broad daylight, and he had to stand there and watch it happen and keep showing up to work every morning and keep answering emails and keep performing the role of a man whose life was under control. The Friday meeting with Richard Harmon lasted 31 minutes. Richard was not unkind. He was precise, which was its own form of kindness, because precision at least leaves no room for false hope. He told Tom that the Q4 shortfall had been a concern, that the Q1 trajectory was not showing the correction he had hoped for, that the division restructure would result in a role change for Tom, not termination, but a lateral move to a client management position that carried a lower base salary and eliminated the performance bonus structure Tom had relied on for 3 years. Tom sat across the desk from Richard and felt something he did not expect to feel: nothing. Not panic, not anger, not the desperate reaching for a counter-argument that his previous self would have deployed immediately. Just a flat, tired nothing, like a room that has been emptied of furniture and hasn't yet decided what it's going to be next. "I understand," Tom said. Richard looked at him with an expression that contained briefly something human, something that might have been sympathy. "Tom, you're a talented person. This is a correction, not a conclusion. Take the role. Stabilize. Rebuild." Tom nodded. He stood up. He shook Richard's hand. He walked out of the office and down the corridor and into the elevator and stood in the lobby of the Meridian Tech Building and thought, this is what the bottom looks like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a lobby on a Friday morning, fluorescent lights, the sound of someone's rolling luggage on the polished floor, and the very clear, very still understanding that you have arrived somewhere you did not plan to be and cannot blame anyone else for being here. He thought about Rachel. He had been thinking about Rachel with increasing frequency over the past weeks. Not with longing, he had examined that possibility and found it was not longing, but something adjacent to it, something more like the specific grief of waste, the way you feel when you understand that something valuable was in your hands and you put it down carelessly and now it is gone, but with a consuming, relentless need to understand what he had actually had and chosen to discard. He had made some calls. Discreet, careful calls because he was still a man with professional relationships to protect and some remaining instinct for self-preservation. A former colleague who had moved into foundation work had confirmed what the article said. A mutual acquaintance from the charity gala circuit, the very gala where Tom had met Rachel, had told him with a carefully neutral voice that did not entirely conceal her astonishment that Rachel Vanderhoven had been known in certain circles for years as one of the most thoughtful and effective philanthropists working in European healthcare funding. Known for years, in certain circles, while Tom had been introducing her as my wife, a nurse good with people. He had gone back to that mutual acquaintance's statement 3 times, known in certain circles. He tried to calculate how many times he had attended events. Had conversations had been in rooms where people knew who Rachel was while he had stood beside her explaining her to strangers, as though she were a pleasant but unremarkable addition to his life rather than the most substantive person in any room she entered. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It arrived the way most real things arrive, slowly, fully, without mercy. He had not lost Rachel because she left. He had lost Rachel because he had never actually found her. He had found a version of her that fit the story he was telling about himself, the successful man with the uncomplicated wife, the achiever with the stable home base, the ambitious person with a partner who asked for nothing because she was content with little. He had constructed this version, furnished it with his assumptions, and lived inside it for 7 years without once questioning whether the Rachel he had built in his mind had any relationship to the Rachel who was actually there. And she had let him. That was the part that kept returning. She had let him build his version and live in it, and she had been patient with it in the way that people are patient when they understand that the truth has its own timeline and will arrive regardless of anyone's readiness. The house sold on April 3rd. The offer came in at $11,000 above, asking from a young couple who had toured it twice and fallen in love with the kitchen and the pergola and the master bath with the heated floors. Tom accepted the offer the same afternoon it arrived. He did not negotiate. He did not perform indifference to drive a better price. He accepted it, thanked the realtor, and spent the rest of the day packing boxes in a house that had cost him more than money. The equity from the sale after the mortgage payoff and the renovation debt and the realtor fees left him with $43,000 and a storage unit and a furnished 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a building in Stamford, 12 minutes as it happened from Rachel's rental building. Though Tom did not know this and would not have known what to do with the information if he had. The move took 1 day. He had less than he thought. When you strip away the things that belong to someone else and the things that were bought on debt and the things that were purchased as props in a performance, what remains is considerably smaller than the performance suggested. He sat in his new apartment on a Saturday evening with boxes around him and a pizza he had ordered because cooking required an investment of care he couldn't access yet. He ate 2 slices. He sat with the quiet. His phone showed a notification, a news alert, one of those algorithmic cruelties that arrive at exactly the wrong time. He had made the mistake weeks ago of searching Rachel's name enough times that his phone had decided to keep him informed. The alert was a link to a social media post from the Vanderhoven Foundation's official account, a photograph from the ribbon cutting at the Children's Cardiac Center in Geneva. The wing was named for Rachel's grandmother. The ribbon was red. The surgical team was arranged in a semicircle, and Rachel was at the center, scissors in hand, and she was laughing, actually laughing full and unguarded and real, the way Tom had seen her laugh maybe a dozen times in 7 years in private moments when she forgot to be contained. He stared at the photograph for a long time. He thought about the night they met. The charity gala, the simple blue dress, the easy laugh, the question about what book he was reading. He thought about how she had said, "That's okay, I'll loan you one," and he had thought it was charming and had forgotten it within a week. He wondered now what book she had meant to loan him. He wondered if he would have read it. He suspected, with the honesty that had become his primary companion in these weeks, that he would not have. He would have set it on the nightstand and meant to get to it and never gotten to it, because there was always something more urgent, more visible, more immediately relevant to the story he was writing about himself. He put his phone face down on the box beside him. He finished his pizza. He looked around the apartment, small, clean, adequate, honest, and made himself stay in it without flinching. This was real. The marble countertops and the pergola and the vice president title with the performance bonus had not been real, or had been real only in the way that performances are real true, while the lights are on gone when the house goes dark. This was what remained. A 1-bedroom in Stamford, $43,000 in savings, a lateral career move, and the education of a man who had been wrong about everything that mattered and had survived being wrong and was now required to decide what to do with the survival. He opened a new note on his phone. He typed one line at the top. He stared at it for a while. Then he closed the phone and went to sleep early because tomorrow was a work day, and the work for now was all he had that was moving forward rather than standing still. In Geneva, Rachel Vanderhoven was at her grandmother's house for dinner. The old woman had cooked, which she insisted on doing herself despite the household staff, and despite her 81 years, because she said cooking for people you love is not a task you outsource. They sat at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room. The kitchen table, and ate and talked about the foundation and the next phase of the hospital project, and Henri's upcoming wedding, and a dozen small things that had nothing to do with Vanity Fair or divorce settlements or the particular education of a man in Connecticut. At the end of the meal, Rachel's grandmother reached across the table and put her hand over Rachel's and said in French, "You look like yourself again." Rachel looked at her. "I've been myself the whole time, Grand-mère." The old woman smiled. "Yes," she said, "but now you look it." Rachel squeezed her grandmother's hand. Outside, Geneva was doing what Geneva does in spring, quietly, efficiently, without drama. The world continued its business, and Rachel Vanderhoven, who had always known exactly who she was, sat in her grandmother's kitchen and was simply completely, entirely herself. In Stamford, Tom Miller slept without dreaming for the first time in months. It was not comfort. It was not resolution. It was simply the sleep of a man who has stopped fighting the truth and is at last too tired to perform. The note Tom had typed into his phone on that first night in the Stamford apartment said 4 words. He had not deleted it. He had not added to it. He had simply let it sit there at the top of his notes app, opening it occasionally, the way you open a wound you are not ready to close, not to reopen it, just to confirm it is still real. The 4 words were, "I was completely wrong." Not about Rachel specifically, about everything, about the system of values he had built his adult life inside, the one that measured people by their visible output. Their titles, their spending power, their willingness to perform ambition in ways he could recognize and rank. He had been wrong about what mattered. He had been wrong about what strength looked like. He had been wrong about what it meant to have something worth keeping. And he had discarded the most consequential proof of that wrongness with a smirk and a pen slid across a dinner table. He went to work every day. The lateral move into client management was humbling in the specific way that humbling needs to be when it is doing its actual work. Not crushing, but persistent, a daily reminder that competence must be rebuilt from the ground up when arrogance has spent years undermining its foundation. His new colleagues were polite. Some of them had heard the story or pieces of it. In the way of office environments, the Vanity Fair revelation had circulated in the particular underground current of professional gossip that moves faster than any official communication and carries more detail. People knew that Tom Miller's ex-wife had turned out to be a European banking heiress. People knew about the divorce terms. Most of them were too professional to say anything directly, which left Tom in this particular discomfort of a man who knows he is being discussed and cannot address it because it is being discussed in the registers of silence. He focused on the work. He answered emails. He returned calls. He showed up early and stayed late, not to impress anyone, but because the apartment was quiet in ways that still required getting used to, and work had the advantage of giving the hours a structure they didn't build themselves. Dan checked in on him twice a week with the steady loyalty of a man who had decided that friendship meant showing up specifically when showing up was inconvenient. He would call on Tuesday evenings and Thursday lunches, and the calls were brief and practical, and occasionally carefully honest. "You doing okay?" Dan asked on a Tuesday in May, 6 weeks into the Stamford apartment. "Better than March," Tom said, which was true. March had been the floor. "Richard mentioned you in a meeting today," Dan said. Tom's hand tightened on the phone. "Good mention or assessment mention?" "Good," Dan said. "He said you'd handled the transition professionally. That's Richard speak, for he's watching to see if you recover." Tom exhaled. "Okay." "It matters, Tom. Don't throw it away." "I'm not throwing anything away," Tom said. And he meant it with a seriousness that would have been unrecognizable to the version of himself who had sat at a dinner table 18 months ago and shoved papers across it with the casual confidence of a man who believed he could afford to waste things. He could not afford to waste things. He understood this now at a cellular level, the way you understand heat after you have been burned. Summer came. The Stamford apartment developed a rhythm. Tom cooked simple meals, which turned out to be something he was moderately good at, and had never known because Rachel had always cooked, and he had always arrived home too late to participate. He ran in the mornings because the financial advisor Carol had pointed out with her particular brand of practical honesty that stress was metabolic and needed somewhere to go. He called his mother on Sundays, which he had been doing infrequently for years, and now did consistently because his mother was 71 and had always known things about him that he had been too busy performing to hear. His mother, a retired school teacher from New Haven named Margaret, who had raised Tom alone after his father left, when Tom was 9, listened to the whole story over 3 Sunday calls. She did not interrupt. She did not editorialize. When he was finished on the 3rd call, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Tom, your father did something similar, you know." Tom went very still. "What do you mean?" "He left because he thought he was going somewhere better," Margaret said. "He thought the life we had was beneath what he deserved. He spent 20 years finding out he was wrong." She paused. "I'm not saying you're your father. I'm saying that the belief that you deserve better than what you have when what you have is actually good, that's a particular kind of blindness. And it runs in families if you don't watch for it." Tom sat with that sentence for a long time after the call ended. He had spent his entire professional life running from the image of his father, the man who had left, who had failed, who had chosen wanting over having, and ended up with neither. He had told himself the ambition, the climbing, the relentless forward motion were the opposite of his father. He had not understood until this moment, sitting in his Stamford apartment on a Sunday afternoon, that he had simply chosen the same blindness in a more expensive suit. He didn't sleep well that night, but it was a productive kind of sleeplessness, the kind that rearranges furniture. September arrived, a year since the divorce. Tom marked it not with ceremony, but with awareness. He woke up that morning knowing what the date was and let himself know it without flinching. He made coffee. He went for his run. He came back and sat at his kitchen table and let the anniversary be real. He was different from the man who had signed the papers across from Rachel a year ago. He could not have told you in a clean list how he was different. It was more structural than that, more like the way a broken bone heals. You can't see the repair from the outside, but the bone is denser at the break point than it was before. He was denser somewhere he hadn't been before, more careful, more honest specifically with himself, which was harder than honesty with other people and more consequential. He had not contacted Rachel. He had thought about it. He had composed at least a dozen versions of a message he never sent, ranging from the formal to the genuine to the ones he deleted immediately out of embarrassment for himself. What would he say? What could he say that would not be primarily about his own need for absolution? She owed him nothing, not her time, not her forgiveness, not the relief of a conversation that would let him feel better about what he had done. She had signed the papers and restored her name and walked back into her life, and that life had turned out to be extraordinary, and none of it required his commentary. He kept not sending the message. He kept the notes app entry with the 4 words. He kept running in the mornings and cooking simple meals and showing up to work and calling his mother on Sundays. He kept being the person he was trying to become quietly without announcing it, because announcing it would have been a performance, and he was done with performances. What he did not know, what he could not have known, because he had deliberately stopped searching her name to protect whatever sanity he had reconstructed, was that Rachel Vanderhoven's life had been moving with the particular purposeful velocity of someone who had been waiting a long time to operate at full capacity and was now doing so without restraint. The Children's Cardiac Center in Geneva had opened in June to significant international attention. Rachel had stood at the entrance and cut the ribbon and given a short speech, characteristically short, characteristically precise, without a single wasted word that had been quoted in 3 European newspapers and 1 American one. The foundation had announced 2 new partnerships with hospital systems in Portugal and Belgium. A profile in a Swiss magazine had called her the most effective private healthcare philanthropist of her generation, and she had read the line once and then used the magazine as a coaster, because Rachel Vanderhoven had never required the world's assessment of her to know her own value. She had also in September met someone. His name was Olivier Marchand. He was a Belgian architect, 41 years old, serious about his work in the way that serious people are serious, with rigor, with humility, with a willingness to be wrong and correct himself without drama. He had been commissioned to design an extension to the Geneva Foundation's main offices, and he had come to Rachel's meeting in July with sketches that showed he had listened to everything she had said in the briefing document and had asked, before presenting anything, whether there were elements she specifically did not want. She had liked that. The asking before presenting. It was the opposite of assumption. They had dinner for the first time in August, ostensibly to discuss the architectural timeline, which they did for the first 20 minutes before the conversation moved somewhere else and kept moving, covering ground with the particular ease of 2 people who have both been paying attention to the world for a long time and find they are looking at many of the same things. He did not ask her about her wealth or her family name until she mentioned it herself 3 dinners in. He simply listened and responded and disagreed with her twice in the first evening politely and specifically, and without concern for whether disagreement would cost him something. She had found this quality so refreshing that she had mentioned it to her grandmother the next day. Her grandmother had said in the dry tone she used for observations, she considered obvious, "A man who is not afraid to disagree with you has nothing to prove. That is a good sign." Rachel had laughed. "You're matchmaking, grand-mère." "I'm observing," her grandmother had said. "They are different activities, though the results occasionally coincide." By October, Rachel and Olivier were together in the quiet, certain way that neither of them needed to announce, because it was simply evident to everyone around them. Henri had met him at a dinner and texted Rachel afterward. "He looks at you the way you're supposed to be looked at." Rachel had read the text and put her phone in her bag and felt something settle in her chest that had been slightly unsettled for a long time. She had not spoken to Tom. She did not intend to. She bore him no particular malice. Malice required ongoing energy she had never allocated to him, and she had learned from women stronger than herself that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. And genuine indifference is one of the most complete freedoms available to a human being. She was indifferent to Tom Miller in the way that she was indifferent to rain that had fallen a year ago. It had happened. It was over. The ground had absorbed it and moved on. What she had not fully anticipated was the news cycle. In November, the Vanderhoven Foundation's annual gala was covered by 3 international outlets and 2 American ones. Photographs from the event circulated widely. Rachel and Olivier had attended together, and a photograph of them, Rachel in a midnight blue dress, Olivier with his hand at the small of her back. Both of them, mid-laugh at something someone off camera had said, had appeared in a society column with a caption that identified them by name and described their relationship as one of Geneva's most talked-about new pairings of the season. The photograph found Tom Miller on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered by the same algorithmic notification system that had shown him the ribbon-cutting photograph 7 months earlier. His phone buzzed on his desk at work. He looked at the screen. He sat very still for a long moment. She was laughing, the same laugh he had seen in the ribbon-cutting photograph, the same full and unguarded and completely real laugh that he had seen only rarely in 7 years, and had not known how to protect when he had it. The man beside her was looking at her with an expression Tom recognized because it was an expression he had worn in the earliest months of their relationship, before he had let himself become too busy and too certain to keep wearing it. It was the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck and intends to be worthy of it. Tom set his phone face down on his desk. He stared at his computer screen. On it was an email thread about a client account renewal that needed his attention, and he read the same opening line 4 times without processing a word of it. His colleague, Sandra, knocked on his open door. "Tom, the 2 o'clock is in 5 minutes. "I'll be right there," Tom said. His voice was steady. He was still good at steady, even when steady was the only thing holding. He went to the 2 o'clock. He contributed appropriately. He followed up afterward with 2 action items sent by email within the hour. He was on the surface a functioning professional on a Tuesday afternoon. Inside, he was somewhere much quieter and much more honest. He thought about the legal pad, the number at the bottom. He thought about Richard Harmon's office and Carol Huang's screen and the click of the front door on the day Jessica left. He thought about Dan's driveway in February and his mother's voice on the phone saying, "That's a particular kind of blindness, and it runs in families if you don't watch for it." He thought about Rachel's hand on the pen, steady and certain, signing a name he had never asked about. He thought about 7 years of a marriage to a woman he had assessed within the first year and never reassessed, never updated, never looked at again with genuine curiosity, and how she had sat across from that incuriosity for 7 years and chosen again and again to be exactly who she was, regardless of whether he was seeing it. He left the office at 5:30. He drove to his apartment. He changed into running clothes and ran longer than usual out past his normal route through streets he didn't usually take until his lungs were burning and his legs were heavy and his mind had quieted to the simple animal clarity of physical effort. He stopped at a park bench. He sat down. He breathed. A couple walked past him, older, maybe 65, and the woman was talking, and the man was listening, with his whole body turned toward her. Not his face, his whole body oriented in her direction, the way a plant orients toward light, and the naturalness of it, the unconscious completeness of it, hit Tom somewhere so specific and so precise that he had to look away. He sat on the bench for a while, then he went home. He opened his notes app. He looked at the 4 words. I was completely wrong. He typed 1 new line under it slowly, the way he typed things he meant. He wrote, "And I will not waste what the wrongness taught me." He closed the app. He made dinner. He called his mother a day early, just because. "You sound different," his mother said. "Different, how quieter," she said, "but not sad quiet, the other kind." Tom thought about this. "Maybe," he said. "Good," his mother said simply, and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular, and it was the best hour Tom Miller had spent in longer than he could cleanly remember. The months that followed were not dramatic. This was one of the things Tom had to learn, that real recovery, real change is not dramatic. It does not have a moment. It has accumulation. Day after day of small choices made correctly, or more correctly than the day before, without an audience and without applause, simply because they are correct. And the cost of incorrectness is something you now understand at a level that makes the correct choice feel less like virtue and more like basic self-preservation. He was promoted back to a senior role in March, 14 months after the lateral move. Richard Harmon delivered the news with the particular satisfaction of a man who had made a calculated bet on a person's capacity to recover and had been proven right. "I told you it was a correction, not a conclusion," Richard said, and Tom shook his hand and thanked him, and meant it without reservation. He was 36 now, leaner than he had been at 34, not from vanity, but from the running which had become the one unbreakable structure in his daily life, the thing that held the hours together on the mornings when nothing else did. He had $43,000 in savings still intact. He had not touched it, had treated it as the emergency fund. It was, instead of the starting point for a new performance, and his debt was down to a single card, nearly paid off, a number so manageable it would have seemed miraculous to the man on the kitchen floor in February 2 years ago. He had not been in a relationship. He had dated twice briefly in the way you date, when you are not yet sure you know yourself well enough to be fair to someone else. Both times he had ended it before it became something because he could feel himself reaching for the comfort of company before he had finished the work of honesty, and he did not want to do to someone else what had been done to Rachel. Not the betrayal that was specific to his character at a specific time, but the more fundamental wrongness. The wrongness of building a relationship on a version of a person you have decided on rather than the person they actually are. He was not sure he had completely finished the work. He was not sure the work was ever completely finished, but he was doing it, which was different from the man he had been. The news about Rachel's engagement broke on a Wednesday morning in April, 2.5 years after the divorce. Tom found out not from his phone this time, but from Dan, who texted him at 8:15 with a single message. Saw the news. You okay? Tom had not yet seen the news. He looked it up immediately. The Vanderhoven Foundation's social media account had shared a brief statement the previous evening. Rachel Vanderhoven and Olivier Marchand had announced their engagement. The statement was 4 sentences long, warm and precise in Rachel's particular style, and included a single photograph. The same photograph, or one so similar in quality that it felt like the same one of Rachel laughing unguarded full completely herself. Tom read the statement twice. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He texted Dan back. Yes, I'm okay. Then he put his phone in his desk drawer, not face down on the desk, but in the drawer, because he needed it to be somewhere he had to make an effort to reach, and he went about his workday with the focused deliberateness of a man who has learned that feelings and function can coexist if you are honest about both. At lunch, he sat alone at his desk and let himself feel what he actually felt, because he had learned that the feelings you don't give room move underground and do damage, while the ones you let surface can be acknowledged and then released. What he felt was not what he might have predicted 18 months ago. It was not the sharp pain of loss or the heat of jealousy. It was something colder and quieter, the grief of permanent recognition. The understanding that the thing you threw away is not returning, and moreover does not need to return because it found something truer without you. It was the most honest grief he had ever felt. It was clean in the way that only honest things are clean. He let it be there. He ate his lunch. He went back to work. He called Dan that evening. I've been thinking, Tom said. About Rachel. About everything, Tom said. About what I'm actually doing. What I actually want. Not the version I had at 34, the real one. He paused. I want to do something that matters, Dan. Not just professionally. Something that I can point to and say that was worth the time I put into it. Dan was quiet for a moment. What does that look like? I don't know yet, Tom admitted. But I think I'm finally asking the right question, which is something. That's more than something, Dan said. They talked for a while. When Tom hung up, he sat in the quiet of his apartment and thought about Rachel standing at the entrance of the Children's Cardiac Center with scissors and a red ribbon and a full, unguarded laugh, and he thought about all the ways that picture represented things he had failed to understand when they were available to him, and he let the understanding be the thing. It was not motivation, not inspiration, not a story. He was telling about his own redemption. Just the truth, the plain, cold, clarifying truth. He had loved her in the way that men love when they don't understand what love requires. He had seen her and failed to see her, held her, and failed to know her, lived beside her every day for 7 years, and never once asked the question that would have cracked everything open. Who are you really? Not as a wife, not as a partner in his story, not as a supporting character in the narrative of Tom Miller's advancement. Who are you, Rachel, in yourself, by yourself, when no one is looking? She would have told him. He was certain of this now. She was the kind of person who answered honest questions with complete honesty. She had simply been waiting for the question, and he had never asked it. And now it was 2.5 years later, and she was engaged to a man who looked at her like that, and the question had been answered by someone else. Tom Miller got up from his kitchen table. He washed his dinner dishes. He set them in the rack to dry. He checked his phone, a message from his mother, asking if he was coming for Thanksgiving, a work email. He would answer tomorrow, nothing else. He turned off the kitchen light. He stood in the dark for a moment before going to bed and let himself have the thought he had been circling for 2 years, the one he had written in 4 words, and then added one line to the one that had been the actual beginning of whatever he was becoming. He was completely wrong. He had wasted something irreplaceable. He had paid the cost of that waste in full and would continue paying in the quieter currencies of knowledge and restraint for the rest of his life. And he was going to live anyway, correctly, deliberately, without the performance and without the blindness, because the only thing worse than having made the mistake would be letting the mistake be the last true thing about him. That was not going to be the last true thing about him. In Geneva, on the same Wednesday evening, Rachel Vanderhoven sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, again the place that had always meant clarity and continuity, and showed her grandmother the photograph of the ring on her phone. Elise Vanderhoven looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Rachel's face. "You're happy," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Rachel said, simply, completely, without qualification. "Does it feel the way you wanted it to feel?" Rachel considered this with the seriousness she brought to every question worth answering. "It feels true," she said finally. "It feels like the first thing in a long time that is exactly what it appears to be." Her grandmother nodded slowly. She put down the phone. She reached for her tea. "Then that is everything," she said. Rachel looked at her, this woman who had built a dynasty from patience and intelligence and the willingness to hold her value without display, who had watched Rachel test a man and fail and rise and find herself again, who had sat across from her at the same table the night it all ended and said, "Good girl," in the voice of someone who had always known and felt the full warm weight of being known completely by someone who loved you completely. "Yes," Rachel said, "it is." Outside, Geneva was moving into spring. The world continued its business without fanfare. And Rachel Vanderhoven, who had stayed silent when silence was strength, who had signed her name and walked away and become exactly who she had always been, sat in the kitchen of the woman who had taught her everything that mattered and was without performance or announcement or the need for anyone's recognition, entirely and irrevocably herself. Some people spend their whole lives searching for that. Rachel Vanderhoven had simply never lost it. She had only briefly let someone mistake it for nothing. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about everything that mattered, and she had known it from the beginning, and she had been right, and the world had confirmed it in the fullest and most permanent way available, not through revenge, not through confrontation, not through any dramatic settling of accounts, but through the simple, unstoppable truth of who she was moving forward at its own pace, arriving exactly where it was always going to arrive. That is the only kind of victory that lasts. And Rachel Vanderhoven had never needed to fight for it. She had simply needed to remain herself. And that, in the end, was everything.